Hey everybody, this is Mark, and welcome back to Beyond Profit, a Global Perspective. If you've been following along our videos recently, we've been talking about theories of international political economy, or more specifically, one big one, and that is liberalism, or shall we say economic liberalism, because there's all sorts of different variants of liberalism. And in that, we talked about the benefits of free trade, this idea that if we break down forms of protectionism and we allow for as much free trade as possible between different countries, through specialization and comparative advantage, it's easier for companies to get their product to those markets where they can sell them most efficiently. And that is great in terms of total prosperity of the country. It's great in terms of prosperity for the business. Some scholars even argue that it's great for democracy. Through interdependence, countries have common interests. They all want to make money, and so they engage in other forms of cooperation, specifically security cooperation, which means that a lot of the wealthiest countries in the world haven't gone to war with each other for a long time, and it creates a fairly secure international system, at least for those who actively participate in the globalization effort. Now, there are some countries that are more isolated, say Russia, for example, who make a lot of money in the international system, but don't engage in the same sort of free trade practices as a lot of other countries do, and therefore, as a non-status quo power, stand to gain if a system like this would fall apart. So that brings up another point, something you may also have noticed if you've been paying attention to some of these videos, right? One of the things we talked about was currency and how different government policies may affect the value of currency, which may cause ripple effects that are negative in other countries. Some countries engage in currency manipulation in order to try to gain trade advantage. So you might ask yourself, what happens if trade disproportionately benefits your rivals? Should you be nervous about this? What happens if some of the materials, the strategic materials you depend on, are in the possession of other countries and you can't access them as easily? Well, when everything's based in the free market and in terms of private business, then it's the private businesses that get to sell that and get to determine where that stuff goes. Should the government have a role in terms of determining what happens with strategic materials because maybe they're concerned with security? And finally, are there situations where trade may threaten the domestic power base? So those people in power maybe don't like the free trade arrangements and want to set it up so that they can maintain their own power. So if you've been asking these questions, then you may understand what I'm getting ready to talk about next, and that is mercantilism, which is the second major theory of international political economy. And we're going to talk about it right now. So before we get into this talk, I wanted to say I hope that you are getting a lot out of these videos. Hopefully you appreciate them. If you do, please like, share, subscribe to this channel. Continue to support me so that I can continue to have the time and effort to be able to share this information with you. In the last video, we talked about how liberal trade policies produce interdependence, which comes with some incredible advantages, but also some risks. We rely on global cooperation to offset those risks, and if we undermine those institutions, we probably increase the risk. However, when you look at Chinese policy, where they're exploiting or breaking the rules of the globalized free trade system and accumulating power by buying influence, maybe we should be concerned about power too. So what does liberalism have to say about power? Not very much. So it's more about making money, right? The stuff that we business students love to talk about. But to understand the global environment, you also have to understand power. Well, prior to the 19th century, this idea of liberal free trade really didn't exist. Monarchies were more like mafia organizations than they were like modern nation states that we see today. They were intimidating their own constituents by taking the firstborn and making them join the army, or imposing taxes, or refusing to raise people's farms. That's how they operated at that time. So they weren't interested in money, they were interested in occupying land because land was power. And to gain more power meant to gain control of more resources. And that really was the foundation of mercantilism. For most of history, up until about the 19th century, trade was not a significant part of what happened when countries interacted with each other. Which makes sense because there wasn't a lot of technology for advanced transportation and communication, and so you were mostly trading on local levels. If there was any major trade happening, then it would probably be reinforced with some form of military power and wealth behind it. So in the 19th century, you have a change in the mode of production because you have the Industrial Revolution, which makes everything more efficient. You can move things around the world, and so there's an increase in trade. At the same time, there's some resistance to this idea of absolute free trade. Consider the East India Company, controlled and bankrolled by the British government as a near monopoly in order to try to dominate trade. And so trade increased, but a lot of it increased because the powers of the time were trying to exploit different parts of the world in order to try to cash in on all the cheap stuff that they could possibly get. That trade contracted significantly, which led up to the Great Depression. And ultimately, by the time World War II is over, we have a Bretton Woods agreement that opens up the economy to all sorts of new forms of trade and really brings in this modern form of globalization where trade and growth just goes absolutely through the roof, along with global prosperity in all sorts of places. So if you look at the grand span of history, mercantilism is really a much older concept than liberalism is. Most people thought that mercantilism was kind of a dead idea. People kind of thought that globalization was inevitable because it was so beneficial for so many people involved. But since the rise of Donald Trump and populist movements and nationalist movements throughout the world, there's this new sense that maybe we should be concerned about the power of rivals, and maybe we should be gearing our economy toward meeting those challenges. A lot of what these people are advocating now is a return to mercantilism. So let's talk about what that means. Mercantilism is the second major theory of international political economy that we're going to talk about in this class. So those of you who are studying international political economy, this is very relevant to you. But if you're in my global management class, then I think it's extremely important that you learn about these theories as well, because understanding what's happening politically in the world and how governments are responding to things in different ways than they have before is absolutely important for you to be able to understand the global environment and make strategic decisions. So mercantilism suggests that companies and countries are not motivated primarily by profit and savings, but by power. It may not be true for all businesses, may not be true for all countries, but this is a lens that we're looking into in order to try to understand how the world might work. Mercantilism has been around for a long, long time, just like I said, hundreds if not thousands of years in various forms. But it was really articulated philosophically for the first time by great thinkers such as Frederick and Alexander Hamilton. Yeah, Alexander Hamilton. Consider this quote from Hamilton himself. It is well known that certain nations grant bounties on the exportation of particular commodities to enable their own workmen to undersell and to supplant all competitors. To be enabled to contend with success, it is evident that the interference and aid of their own government are indispensable. So, a lot of times we Americans like to glorify the founding fathers and think about them as these sort of free market radical economists that really just believe in free enterprise and keeping the government out of people's backyards, when Alexander Hamilton was exactly the opposite. He wanted the government actively involved in the economy in order to protect certain aspects of that, such as the banking industry or resources and things like that. So that's Hamilton's perspective. Frederick List argues this: it is true that protective duties at first increase the price of manufactured goods, but it is just as true that in the course of time, those goods are produced more cheaply at home than the price at which they can be imported from foreign parts. It not only secures to the nation an infinitely greater amount of material goods, but also industrial independence in case of war. So think about this. It's exactly the opposite of the argument that we pointed out when we talked about specialization and free trade. What List wants to do is use protectionist policies in order to try to protect certain industries. Take tariffs, for example. Tariffs is a method that some people use in order to try to protect domestic industries. His argument is, oh yeah, it's going to cause prices to increase. We know this happens. But he also says, hey, it's not going to be a permanent thing. And the benefit of it is that if we produce things locally, then we'll have control over these things, which means that our security will be improved. A country's decision makers are going to be concerned, first of all, about the security of the country itself, but they might also be concerned with their own power. And so when you're thinking about mercantilism, don't think about it as making money or being respectful of private property or of any of the kind of things that we tend to value when we talk about free market economics, right? We're thinking about how do we keep the current people in power, and how do we protect the country itself from possibly threatening external powers. Wealth translates into power in terms of economic and military power. But the main purpose of a national economy should be to increase its power, not necessarily increase its wealth, because those two things are not the same thing. If we were really concerned with wealth, then we'd be liberal all the time and we'd free trade everything and make a gazillion dollars more than we did before. But there are some things, perhaps, that are worth protecting, and maybe we shouldn't just free trade absolutely everything. Countries, or nation states if you like, must focus on the distribution of gains. So there's a different perception that happens. When you are a mercantilist, you are concerned with relative gains. That is, how much am I making versus how much is everybody else making? How many resources do I have versus what everybody else has? How strong is my military versus other people's military? And so mercantilists are concerned about that, whereas liberals, on the other hand, are look at things more in terms of absolute gains. That is, that if we exchange with each other, then we all benefit in ways that are both measurable and immeasurable. Mercantilists then gauge success in relative terms. So I, as a mercantilist leader, might be more concerned about the economic growth of China versus the United States and perceive that as a threat. And so instead of allowing trade to sort of continue and allow us both to make money, we may want to engage in policies that restrict China's growth or increase our own. Mercantilists will argue that countries use trade in order to maintain a power advantage versus other countries, and states must take action to tip market outcomes in their favor. Here are some domestic policy recommendations that mercantilists suggest. One is emphasis on the structure of the economy, producing the right things. So we're not talking about just specializing in things that we might naturally be good at, like liberals and people who like comparative advantage, like they would suggest. We need to focus on those things that are going to be important and essential to our security, right? There's certain industries maybe that we need that will help with our security, making sure that we can feed ourselves, right? Agriculture, that becomes very important as well. Second, there's the need for high value industries. That is, let's focus on the stuff that's going to make us a whole lot of money, because that's going to convert to a whole lot more power. And then you create advantage through industrial policies aimed at altering the structure rather than the size of the economy. What do I mean by that? Well, the size of the economy grows when you have lots and lots of trading. In this case, we're not worried about growing the economy nearly as much as we are choosing certain things that would be beneficial to us. Some international policy recommendations include, first, making sure that the country gains relatively more from international exchange than other states. That is, you're going to push for better terms of trade with other countries, and you're going to push for a trade balance that is favorable to you. Now, a lot of economists argue that trade balance doesn't matter that much at all, but to mercantilists, it seems to matter a great deal. Second is to ensure trade protections. So mercantilists believe in this idea of autarky. That is, that the country should be self-sufficient. We shouldn't have to excessively buy a whole lot of stuff that we need. We should be making it ourselves. Importing is bad, exporting is good. It's important to maintain a surplus, especially of resources like oil and reserve assets like gold. And we should ensure that we have adequate energy independence. They also want to engage in strategic trade. So that's where we get into some of these policies, like I already mentioned tariffs as one means of protectionism. There's others that we'll talk about in more detail, such as subsidies, but import quotas, that is limiting the number of imports that come into the United States from certain countries, right? If we feel like our industry is being threatened, then we're going to let less of those products from other countries enter. And there's other things too, voluntary export restraints, non-tariff barriers, but we'll focus on a few of those things when we get into this a little bit later. And then investment controls. Maybe we don't want certain countries investing in our countries because it may make us potentially vulnerable from a security standpoint. Maybe there's certain businesses or industries that seem threatening, like there was this huge thing about whether or not we ought to ban TikTok because the Chinese government is gathering private information about the United States and citizens from other countries as well. Should we not have TikTok because it is unsafe to us? Right? Or do we want to attract more foreign direct investment because more money means we've got a stronger industrial base? There's all sorts of ways you can play that. But the point is the government wants to be involved in terms of picking how much and who should be contributing. And the government's picking winners and losers in this case, which is very contrary to the free trade position. What kinds of tools do mercantilists use to preserve autarky? One is currency manipulation. And if you didn't watch the video on currency manipulation that came before this, go back and check it out. They want to use surpluses to maintain power and buy influence. They use the military to secure resources. They protect their industries and existing resources, and they want to keep, if you're in charge, you want to keep your citizens and workers from revolting. So all of these things have to do with power. Let's talk about military for a second. It's not something we typically talk about in international business class, but it's probably relevant here. In 2002, George Bush took the United States to war in Iraq, and the ostensible justification for that was that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, he was supporting terrorists, and we need to get rid of this bad man and install democracy there. Now, these were all reasonable justifications, right? Even if we trust Bush 100% and say in his heart of hearts, like he really believed that there were weapons of mass destruction there, which there weren't, where he really thought that democracy was possible there, which is yet to be seen, who knows, you still would be an absolute idiot if you would ignore the fact that Iraq sits on one of the biggest sources of oil in the entire world. I'm not saying he went to war for oil necessarily, but I'm saying that anybody who's making a strategic justification for an incursion someplace in the world like that is going to take a variable like that fairly seriously, because there's lots of places that we don't go to war, and there are bad men there, and maybe they need democracy, and maybe there are terrorists there, but they're not sitting on a huge vat of oil. The tools that mercantilists may use involve protectionism. And we talked about this also in previous videos. We talked about tariffs and quotas and subsidies and how they all work, so please check out that video. Politicians use them to protect jobs, industry, resources, to prevent these from going overseas and to protect their own political power. In a previous video, we also talked about the Bush tariffs from 2002 to 2003 and how they hurt the broader economy, offered little relief to steelworkers, but delivered a political benefit to Bush, and how companies can retaliate with a favorable WTO ruling. That is, like, if you are engaging in certain tariff policies of protectionism that is not endorsed by the World Trade Organization, then other countries can retaliate against you. We'll talk more on that later on when we get into subsidies. And we also talked before briefly about the Trump tariffs, and I want to talk a little bit more about them now. So Trump, like Bush, put tariffs on steel and aluminum from 2018, and they were in effect until 2021. That is basically effectively when Biden came into office. What happened there? Well, it's kind of a mixed bag. Metal prices went up and down, jobs in those industries sort of went up and down, and it's hard to nail down a cause, right? Was it tariffs? Was it something else? The evidence is a little bit scattered. The 2020 pandemic killed demand for construction, and it deflated prices. Then it picked up again with all the federal spending on construction, so that affected the employability of people who are in those industries. Trump lifted tariffs on Mexico and Canada in 2019 after the renewal of the USMCA, so that also affected things because those were, at that time, the tariffs were not in place. And then Biden lifted tariffs on the EU in 2021. How did this play out when Trump started a trade war with China and its allies in 2019? Well, here's some of the consequences. It undermined the power of the World Trade Organization, which, as we've said before, sets rules for the way the countries can interact with each other economically, in order to try to protect this liberalized trade order. We alienated our allies. We gave legal justification for retaliatory tariffs by the WTO allies. So in other words, those friends of ours who we basically cut off as a result of tariffs then had a right to retaliate legally against us. It increased costs to businesses. It was inflationary for consumers. You can review some of these things by also going back and watching the tariff video. An NPR Morning Edition report documented China's expansion since then. So far from hurting China, it's actually helped China in some significant ways. Its manufacturing sector is about 1/3 of the global total, and it's still expanding. Their consumer market can't absorb it all now, so Chinese companies are starting up factories locally, that is in many places around the world, to access more global consumer markets. Where is China investing? Well, first in ASEAN countries. If you're not familiar with that acronym, we're talking about the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, specifically Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, Indonesia. It's making inroads in the Middle East, specifically in Saudi Arabia and Oman. Latin America has been important for state-owned enterprises for mining resources, and the greater local presence also means that unions and companies may rethink their wages and then influence the government about what industrial policy that they should follow, that would be more influenced by the Chinese. China is negotiating to export more to European markets and to try to take advantage of lower tariffs, avoiding the US market altogether. Was there a better way to put tariffs on China? Perhaps one could argue that if the United States teamed up with its European allies to try to point out the unfair trade practices that China was engaging in and effectively put sanctions on it, that might have been a more cooperative option. Another idea would have been for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP agreement, to actually be enacted. Now, that was something that Trump was seriously opposed to the first time that he ran for office, and something that eventually did not go through Congress in part because of Trump's influence. But what it would have done is open doors for more access to Asian markets throughout the larger Pacific area for the United States, and open the opportunity for us to continue to sell in those markets. It also means that we would continue to have an economic presence, because it involved pretty much every country, every significant country in that East Asian area, Southeast Asian area, except for China. So we had some pretty serious potential inroads. Now that that has not happened, guess what has happened? Right? China's come up with its own version of that, so now they are exporting and they are supplying, and they are the ones with those economic connections to all of those countries in our absence. Under what circumstances should tariffs be tolerated or maybe encouraged? I might say, first of all, maybe national security. If we are producing something and we really don't want that to come into the hands of serious security rivals, then maybe that's one option. Maybe that's a tool. Second, I would argue sanctions. Like, if we collectively want to punish another state based on bad behavior, we can get together with other countries and cooperate in that way, as we just discussed. Maybe to combat predatory trade policies, such as China's, which we've already talked about, to use tariffs within the rules that are allowed by the World Trade Organization, such as maybe it's justifiable for some countries to use tariffs to protect their infant industries, or targeted tariffs, areas where individual industries can be targeted for protection or for negotiating lower rates. Now, the Trump administration has claimed to do some of that. However, Trump also has argued that he's a tariff guy. Like, he doesn't just want to do this to try to secure a better deal. He's doing it because he thinks it's good policy in terms of the way economics should happen in terms of global trade. Tariffs are one form of protectionism that mercantilists like to employ. We've talked about some others, but I want to talk a little bit more detail on subsidies for just a little bit. So what are subsidies? The government is giving money directly to an industrial sector to ensure its survival. So why should we subsidize any industry, and which industries should we subsidize? Well, the motivation for subsidizing industries, one would argue, is perhaps power and security. Same motivation as when we talked about tariffs and other forms of protectionism. Which industries? Consider the military-industrial complex, semiconductors, agriculture, banks, the automotive industry, many, many more. We're going to talk about a few examples here. First, let's talk about the military-industrial complex. We already mentioned in a previous video that military aid basically consists of money going from the United States government directly to the contractor who makes the planes or whatever that gives them away to other countries. Now, of course, some countries actually do purchase those as well, and they sometimes have to get permission from the United States in order to do that. We don't want just everybody buying fighter jets or whatever weaponry it is we have to offer, so it is regulated, but it is also subsidized. Like, how does Boeing get most of their contracts? How do they get paid? Well, primarily through Congress. Likewise, who benefits from war reconstruction? Well, that's an interesting question. If you look back at World War II, we had a Marshall Plan afterwards where the United States paid local businesses to rebuild their own countries. And by doing so, we built strong economies that then those countries went on to become our allies. If you contrast that with the way that we treated Iraq after the first Iraq War, or during that time period, once Saddam Hussein was deposed, it was quite different. The United States, rather than offering money to local businesses, and they did do it to some, basically gave a lot of its money to major American contractors like Halliburton, and they were the ones who benefited from that war reconstruction. So it's important to remember, military-industrial complex, that whatever it is that we want done is basically coming from our pockets into the hands of usually American private businesses. Also consider other strategic industries. The U.S. CHIPS and Science Act, signed into law in 2022, it's a $280 billion initiative aimed at bolstering domestic semiconductor production, research and development, and creating a more resilient supply chain. Why? Well, in part, those chips that are being manufactured at basically a plant in upstate New York are essential not just for our manufacturing economy, because they're needed in like cars and other sorts of consumer products, but also for military applications as well. Now let's talk about the auto industry bailout of 2008. Keep in mind, there was a Great Recession. It wiped out a lot of homes, a lot of businesses. The economy was in really big trouble. And between GM, Chrysler, and Ford, all of them were facing significant challenges. And GM and Chrysler basically asked the government to bail them out. Ford did not. The government agrees. They're going to bail out these businesses. And before we get into the specifics of that case study, I want to ask you a question. What impact do you think that had on Toyota? So Toyota is one of the biggest automakers in the world. After the Great Recession, it became the biggest automaker in the world. But here's the deal. If two major auto companies go out of business or seek bankruptcy, then that means their production is going to be reduced or eliminated altogether. Who's going to pick up that demand? Toyota, right? Or it could be a number of companies, it could be Honda, but whoever is dominant in the market is going to make up that difference, and there's going to be an advantage for them. So by the United States government saying, hey, we're going to bail out these two major automakers, they're really hurting Toyota, and they are not promoting a level playing field when it comes to a free market economy. Before we get too critical about it, it might be worth asking the question, why was it necessary to bail out GM and Chrysler? And according to Alan Mulally, who was the CEO of Ford at the time, he argued that the economy would take a 10% hit. This is his quote: "The industry is so interdependent. We're nearly 10% of the US GDP, and if one of the automobile manufacturers get into serious trouble, it has just tremendous implications for the entire industry." So let's talk about those implications, right? So we've just mentioned that a 10% hit to the US economy, I mean, 1 out of every $10 now is not going to be spent. That's crazy. Now, how do you think Mulally came up with that figure? Well, you've got to think about how huge the US auto industry is in the United States and the whole world for that matter, because building a car isn't something that just happens inside a single factory, right? You have to get the raw materials, you have to make the tires, you have to make the electronic components and the stereo equipment that goes inside the car and all of the computer bits and all of the seat covering and everything that goes into it. I mean, all of that stuff is being manufactured at multiple locations, and then it's being assembled in a car plant. So there's a whole lot that's involved. Now, if these companies stop making cars, or that the numbers are seriously reduced, what happens to all of those other businesses? So a couple of major automakers go out of business. That means that the people who make the paint go out of business. The people who provide the tires go out of business. So it's not just a hit to the economy. There's a lot of unemployment that's attached to that. Now, if people lose their jobs, they have less money to spend, and there are side effects to local economies. So I don't have a job now. That means that, okay, I have to make some tough choices. Am I going to go get my hair cut anymore? Well, maybe not. What happens to the hairdresser? Am I going to go out to eat anymore? Well, what happens to the restaurant? We can go on, but with massive numbers of people not having jobs and not having that money to spend, yes, it creates an economic hit, but it also puts a lot of businesses out of business. And then all those people don't have money to spend anymore either. And so consumer spending declines, which is, again, an important indicator of the economy, but has important real side effects for the lives of people. These same people who can't pay their bills are going to be unable to pay for their houses. So that's another thing that was happening in 2007, 2008. Loads of people who were just walking away from their homes because they couldn't pay the bills. And because the housing values went down because of the financial crisis, like, you couldn't sell your house and you couldn't pay your bills. And so people would just disappear. They'd just leave their house with all their stuff in it. And a lot of people ended up homeless. Another concern would be what would happen next. If people end up losing their homes and homeless, then where does this put us in terms of the desperation of people? Well, is there a potential for public disorder? There's the potential, certainly, for politicians being given the boot, right? Because people vote. If the economy goes down south, then you know those representatives are going to be in trouble as well. And then the ultimate consequence could be government overthrow. Do we feel like our government is so unresponsive that we can't do anything about it? And before you say, whoa, that's a little bit too far, consider that during the Great Depression, that was a serious concern, that because Herbert Hoover had allowed the American economy to go so far south that so many people were in trouble, a lot of people were afraid that we're going to have some sort of communist revolution inside the United States to overthrow the existing U.S. government, and a good lot of what they were trying to do was trying to offset that possibility. When given a choice, a lot of lawmakers voted to support that bailout. And it makes sense if you think about it. How are we going to take care of these people? Is it better just to allow them to lose their jobs and then try to support them on a welfare payroll? Or is it better just to keep those jobs in place and let them continue to work and support those businesses until they're able to pay them back? So no, it's not a free market solution. It's very anti-capitalist. But at the same time, well, tough times may demand tough measures. So now I want to talk a little bit about agriculture. Why do you think agriculture is so heavily subsidized? The answer to that question has probably more to do with food security than it does with anything else. That is, imagine a situation where we are cut off from global food supplies. How would we make it if we weren't able to feed ourselves? If we really wanted free market specialization, that is, liberalization of the agricultural market, what that would mean is that we would let the countries who are really good at agriculture specialize in what they're best at, right? So the United States, we have high cost of labor, high value of land. None of that really recommends itself to an awesome ag industry. Now, we do have other ways that we can compensate. Don't get me wrong. There's loads of technology. We're very efficient. The United States is a great agricultural powerhouse. But if we were to allow other countries to specialize in what they're good at, could we really compete with, say, the cheap prices and the low wages in the Philippines or in places in Africa? And the answer is probably not. It would be very hard to. So if we started relying on these other countries to specialize and we just trade with them because they're the ones who are more efficient at producing those things, it would make food a whole lot cheaper, probably a whole lot more accessible. But if there's any problems, that means that we wouldn't be able to access it nearly as well ourselves. So it's not just the United States who engage in subsidies, right? All of the other major powers do as well. So what is it about subsidies that is potentially problematic in terms of global trade? Well, think about it. The United States, by subsidizing its farmers, is basically ensuring that they are going to survive one way or another, which gives them a lot of latitude on the market to put their prices where they want them to be. And so it's essentially the United States government supporting farmers to undercut the costs of other farmers throughout the world. And when it's big rich United States or big rich Japan or big rich EU, those poorer countries have a really hard time competing. And that's kind of sad because, like, if that's what they're really good at, this could be their opportunity to get rich. But we continue to allow these countries to be impoverished because we don't allow them the opportunity to specialize in something they're really good at, something they really could make a lot of money in, and maybe start preventing the need for us to offer them foreign aid and humanitarian aid and maybe give them the opportunity to grow. But it's our food security and our subsidy policy that we just can't get rid of that continues to stymie a lot of these countries and keep them from proper growth. And there are other reasons why we continue on with these subsidy policies beyond that of food security. First, think about what would happen if we allow other countries to specialize in that and we stop subsidizing our agricultural base. What would happen to the farmers? If fewer people are buying American agricultural products, there's a whole infrastructure that would just fall apart. Small towns would be vacated. People would go, it's basically the same scenario as the auto bailout thing, where communities basically are going to experience localized poverty and unemployment. And the government doesn't want to do that. Certainly, the local politicians don't want that to happen. If you're a state representative, are you going to be able to make that work? If you're in Congress, are you going to be able to sell that to your ag constituents? Not so much. So politicians would lose the support of interest groups and potentially lose elections if they don't continue to support these policies. Now we come to one of my favorite case studies. It's about the cotton industry. Now, that may not seem very exciting to you, but bear with me. I think this is really interesting. In 2010, Planet Money did a special presentation, a report, and the idea was that it wanted to illustrate how globalization worked by making Planet Money t-shirts. And they were going to start with getting the raw materials and go all the way through the production process and learn about how does global economy work. So great idea, right? So they come to the very first program, they're starting to talk about raw materials and what do you need for a t-shirt? You need cotton. So they are investing in the cotton industry to try to find the best deal on the cotton in order to try to make their t-shirt. So first place they look is in the United States. They go to several southern states, they eventually come around to Texas, and after talking to several Texan farmers, they realize that there's a lot of buzz happening about the cotton industry in Brazil. And the Texans are complaining about the Brazilians, and the people who are investigating this are going like, what's up with Brazil? Why? They actually go down to Brazil and they talk to the Brazil agriculture minister. This minister himself was a cotton farmer. So they ask the ag minister, what's going on and why is it that these Texans are complaining about the Brazilian cotton trade? He says, well, the problem really is with the United States, that the United States is subsidizing their cotton crop. Okay, now, hold on for a minute. Didn't we just say that subsidies were mostly about food security? Under the World Trade Organization, we're allowed to put subsidies because it is about food security. But cotton, does anybody eat cotton? No. And the Brazilians are arguing that that's unfair, that as a result of the United States government subsidizing American cotton, it has become difficult for the Brazilians to compete in the market and created an uneven playing field. They want farmer versus farmer, they want a level playing field, they want it to be fair. So what do? The Brazilian government then, on behalf of these farmers, goes to the World Trade Organization and says, hey, the United States is engaging in unfair trade practices and they need to stop it and they need to cut off those subsidies so we can have a fair chance to try to compete in a free and open market. You know what the World Trade Organization says? It sides with Brazil and it says, hey Brazil, because the United States is cheating you essentially, we're going to allow you to retaliate against the United States any way you want to in terms of economics and trade. What do you think the Brazilians do? I mean, the first thing you might think of is, boy, now they're allowed to put tariffs on America. They could do all kinds of things. But again, we're faced with the same problem where America is this big and Brazil is kind of this big. So what do? They become very clever and they write letters. They write letters to trade organizations that deal with the export of U.S. luxury products. Not cotton, not agriculture, but stuff that's really high end that the United States sells, luxury automobiles and the like. In this letter, they say we are going to cut off trade with the United States in terms of its luxury goods until this cotton dispute is solved. Now you can imagine the people who are exporting the luxury goods, they're sitting there saying, I don't know anything about the cotton industry. Why are you picking on me, right? So why do you think they're picking on them? Because they've got money, because they're among the wealthiest people in the United States based on their industry, and they've got influence. So if the Brazilian government is telling them, hey, go to Washington and fix this thing so we can buy from you again, they start doing that. So they start talking to Congress people, and they're like, hey, we need to get rid of these subsidies, otherwise the Brazilians are going to stop buying this stuff from us. So what happens? Congress sends a delegation down to the Brazilian government to negotiate with the Brazilian farmers and try to see whether or not there's some sort of a resolution that can come about from this dispute. Brazilian farmers insist that the United States has to completely get rid of their subsidies. In the meantime, the delegation is telling these people that, like, well, we can't get rid of the subsidies because, what did I just say, right? It's going to undermine little rural communities and, yeah, these politicians are going to be out of jobs. And sooner or later, what happens is somebody in the U.S. delegation gets the idea, hey, we're subsidizing our industry. Why don't we also subsidize yours? And the Brazilians were like, okay. So as a result of this WTO ruling and the ensuing politics that happened, we then subsidized the Brazilian government and their farmers in order to try to create a level playing field for them. Now, if you're worried if they're still in place, I've got some news for you. They were in place from 2010 to 2013. And they essentially stopped in exchange for a promise that they would fix the problem in the next ag bill, that is, cut back those subsidies, but that bill didn't ever pass. Now, hypothetically, they could take the United States back to the WTO again if we failed to deliver on this promise, but here's the latest. Over the past 2 decades, U.S. cotton subsidies have fallen significantly. So we've sort of done what we said we were going to do, maybe just not in the way that we said we were going to do it. It went from an average of almost $2.5 billion per year between 2000 and 2009 to just over $700 million per year between 2010 and 2019. So it's not probably 100% what the Brazilians love, but it's a lot better from their perspective than it was before. But if you look at this chart, you can see there's a much more significant problem now, is that China has turned around and started funding their cotton farmers to the tune of over $8 billion, dwarfing the US, India, Turkey, EU, and Brazil in terms of the support for their own farmers. So let's sum up some of the big ideas in terms of mercantilism. 1, how does the economy work? Capitalism's optimal, but market outcomes determine the relative wealth and power of states and others in international politics, and so we may be a little skeptical about capitalism and what its outcomes are going to be if it's going to potentially threaten us and our dominance or our power position vis-a-vis other countries in the world. Second, what is the economy for? It's to increase power, particularly for the nation state. The powerful utilize resources to maintain and gain more power relative to adversaries. And the third, what is the relationship between politics and economics? Economics is subordinate to politics. Politics is more important because power is more important. It can be used for larger international political struggles. And structures of the international economic system are largely determined by the interests of the major economic powers. All right, so what did we learn? We learned that mercantilism is the second major theory of international political economy, and it looks at the world a whole lot differently than liberals do. Part of mercantilists' purpose is to try to use methods of protectionism to protect industries or to protect workers, right? They do the industries because they're interested in resources, they're interested in production, they're interested in making those things which can make you self-sufficient. That's going to protect your autarky. But at the same time, they are also interested in maintaining their own power base. Thus, we want to continue to satisfy those workers that work in those industries, whether you're talking about a steel worker or whether you're talking about an agricultural worker. But it's important to remember that really it is about the power. It is about the security. It's not like these politicians are looking at these poor people and saying, wow, how can we improve their way of life? The idea behind mercantilism is that we're interested in power and security first and foremost. The notion that they're going to help out the little guy, that's not really part of their calculation. Are there some good things to learn from this perspective? Absolutely. Should we be concerned with relative security and where we stand versus other countries? Probably so. Should we have enough resources to take care of ourselves? Absolutely. But where does that lie on this continuum? At what point do we want to have government policy that is so restrictive that it might constrain the economy and make us less profitable and prosperous, versus at what point do we want to allow the government to determine security policy in a way that robs that from us and prevents us from being able to do the things that we want to do both as consumers and as business people as well. Everything I taught you before about liberalism is still absolutely true. You're still going to make a whole lot more money by specializing. And the benefits, including the collaborative, cooperative security benefits, those things all tend to be real. But at the same time, you got to understand why some people might be a little bit nervous about some of those arrangements. As with all theories, what we learn, what we get out of it is somewhat relative. And I think the same thing is true with mercantilism. And we're going to have some other videos and learn about some other things. But there's actually a third theory of international political economy that we'll introduce very soon, which is, I don't know, a lot like mercantilism in terms of its critique of liberal capitalism, but at the same time, has a slightly different spin. A little more concerned about not so much the people who are in power, but the people who aren't. We're going to start shifting and thinking a little bit about that, because up until now, we've been primarily concerned about money and profit, like liberalism, or in this case, power and security, which is mercantilism. But in the near future, we'll start talking about things that start taking people seriously. So I'll just leave it up to you in terms of determining where you stand, right? I mean, my job here is really to share information with you, but I hope that you're going to come to your own conclusions based on some of this stuff and do some of your own research. So until next time, have a good one. I will see you soon.